I'm 85 years old now. When you reach this age, people assume you have peace, wisdom, maybe even clarity. They imagine you sitting quietly, content, looking back with satisfaction. That image is comforting, but it's mostly a lie. The truth is harder, and that's why I'm speaking now. Not to sound wise, not to inspire admiration, but because I've finally run out of excuses, and time has stripped away every illusion I used to hide behind. For the first 65 years of my life, I believed I was doing everything right. I followed the rules that everyone agreed were responsible. Work first, stability first, sacrifice now, enjoy later. I thought patience was a virtue, that delaying joy was maturity, and that someday when the conditions were perfect, I would finally live the life I wanted. That belief cost me more than I can explain in a single sentence. I didn't wake up one day and decide to waste my life. Nobody does. It happens quietly, 1 year at a time, one postponed dream at a time, one not now stacked on top of another, until suddenly, decades are gone and you can't remember when you stopped choosing and started drifting. In my 30s, I was ambitious. In my 40s, I was busy. In my 50s, I was tired. In my 60s, I told myself it was too late to change. And by the time I reached 70, I realized the most painful truth of all. It was never too late to change. I was just too afraid to do it earlier. The lie that traps most people isn't failure, it's success. Success keeps you obedient. It rewards you just enough to keep you running in the same direction, even when that direction no longer makes sense. I achieved what I was supposed to achieve. I earned respect. I built a reputation. I provided. And yet, when I look back now, none of those things are what haunt me in the quiet moments. What haunts me are the conversations I rushed through, the weekends I gave away, the trips I said I'd take next year, the hobbies I abandoned because they weren't productive, the relationships I assumed would always be there because they had always been there before. You don't feel these losses immediately. That's what makes them so dangerous. Life doesn't warn you when you're making irreversible trades. It doesn't announce, "This is the last time," or "This choice will echo for the rest of your life." It just lets you decide and keeps the receipt. I learned this lesson late, through watching people disappear. Friends who worked themselves into the ground and never got to enjoy the life they were building. Colleagues who retired and realized they had nothing waiting for them. Loved ones who died suddenly, taking with them every unsaid word and unresolved moment. Each loss felt like a small alarm bell, but I kept pressing snooze. For a long time, I told myself I was being responsible, that I was doing what adults do. But responsibility, without intention, slowly becomes surrender. You stop asking whether your life feels right and start asking only whether it looks right from the outside. Here is what I want you to understand before you repeat my mistake. Time does not wait for clarity. It doesn't pause until you feel ready, confident, or secure. It moves forward, regardless of your plans, your fears, or your excuses. And one day, quietly, without drama, you will realize that most of your life is already behind you. When that moment comes, you won't wish you had worked more. You won't wish you had impressed more people. You won't wish you had been safer. You will wish you had been braver sooner. This is not a speech about quitting your job or rejecting responsibility. It's about something far more uncomfortable. Paying attention. Paying attention to how you spend your days. Because your days are your life. Paying attention to what you keep postponing, because those are often the things that matter most. Paying attention to the people you assume will always be there, because they won't. At 85, I can tell you this with absolute certainty. Later is the most dangerous word in the language. It sounds harmless, responsible, rational. But later is where dreams go to quietly die. In the next part, I'll tell you the exact moment I realized I had spent most of my life preparing to live instead of actually living, and what I did after it was already too late. The moment everything became clear didn't arrive with drama. There was no hospital bed, no flashing lights, no doctor using serious words. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind you forget as soon as it ends. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, staring at a calendar, when I realized something that stopped me cold. There were fewer pages ahead of me than behind me. Up until that moment, time had always felt abstract. Old age was a distant idea, something theoretical. Even in my 60s, I still thought of myself as someone with time. But that afternoon, for the first time, I saw my life not as a long road stretching forward, but as a short hallway with more doors already passed than remaining. And with that realization came fear not of death, but of waste. I began doing a quiet inventory of my life. Not the public version, not the resume, the private one, the one nobody applauds. And what I saw disturbed me. I had spent decades optimizing for efficiency, stability, and approval, while slowly starving the parts of myself that actually felt alive. I had become very good at being busy. Busy is an impressive disguise. It convinces you and everyone else that you are moving forward, when often you're just moving faster in circles. I filled my days with obligations, deadlines, and responsibilities, and told myself that was adulthood. But deep down, something was missing. I just didn't know how to name it back then. When you are young, you think meaning is something you earn later, after struggle. When you are old, you realize meaning is something you neglect at your own risk. I noticed how rarely I felt present. Meals were eaten while thinking about the next task. Conversations were endured instead of experienced. Moments passed without being absorbed. I was physically there, but mentally always somewhere else, usually in the future, chasing a version of life that never quite arrived. The cruel irony is this: the future I kept preparing for eventually became the present, and I treated it the same way. I postponed joy again, I delayed connection again, I told myself, just a little longer. And time, silently obedient, kept moving. One evening, I visited an old friend in a nursing home. He had been sharp, successful, admired. Now he sat in a small room with a view of a parking lot. We talked about trivial things until he suddenly said, "I thought I was building a life. Turns out I was just renting one." That sentence stayed with me. I began to understand that a life can look full and still feel empty. That productivity is not the same as purpose. That being needed is not the same as being fulfilled. And that no amount of external success can compensate for internal neglect. Around that time, I also noticed how uncomfortable silence made me. Silence forced reflection, and reflection revealed questions I had avoided for decades. Questions like, what do I actually enjoy? Who am I when nobody expects anything from me? If tomorrow were my last day, would today have been worth living? These are not pleasant questions. That's why most people drown them out with noise, work, entertainment, obligations, constant distraction. But unanswered questions don't disappear. They wait, and they grow heavier with time. I don't want you to misunderstand me. I loved many parts of my life. I loved people. I had moments of genuine happiness. But those moments were fewer than they needed to be, not because life denied them to me, but because I delayed choosing them. The greatest cost of waiting is not regret, it's numbness. Over time, postponing what matters dulls your ability to feel fully. You adapt to dissatisfaction, you normalize it, you call it just how life is, until one day you realize you've been living at half intensity for decades. That realization hurt. But it also freed me, because once you accept that time is limited, not someday, but now, you stop negotiating with your life, you stop asking for permission, you stop waiting for the perfect conditions that never arrive. In the next part, I'll explain what changed after that realization, what I stopped doing immediately, what I started doing despite fear, and why simplicity turned out to be far more powerful than ambition ever was. After that realization, nothing changed on the outside, at least not immediately. I didn't quit my responsibilities overnight. I didn't announce a dramatic reinvention. But inside, a line had been crossed. I could no longer pretend I didn't know the truth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The first thing that changed was what I stopped doing. I stopped treating exhaustion as a badge of honor. For most of my life, being tired made me feel important. It meant I was needed. It meant I was relevant. But exhaustion is often just a sign that you're trading your life for approval. When I finally rested, truly rested, I realized how long I had been running from myself. I stopped saying yes automatically. This was harder than it sounds. My identity had been built on being reliable, available, agreeable. Saying no felt selfish, but every unnecessary yes was stealing time from something else, usually from the people and experiences that mattered most. I learned that boundaries are not walls, they are doors. You choose when to open. I also stopped postponing difficult conversations. For years, I avoided discomfort in the name of peace. I told myself silence was maturity. It wasn't. It was fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of being misunderstood. And that fear quietly eroded relationships I thought would last forever. Then there were the things I started doing despite feeling foolish, late, or afraid. I started choosing presence over productivity. When I was with someone, I tried to actually be there. No mental rehearsals. No checking the clock. No half listening while planning the next task. Presence sounds simple, but it's one of the rarest skills in modern life. And once you experience it, you realize how little of your past you truly lived. I started doing small things I had no reason to do. Long walks without purpose, reading without extracting lessons, sitting in silence without trying to fix it. These moments felt unproductive, even irresponsible at first. But they restored something ambition had slowly taken away, the ability to feel. I also began reconnecting with people, with parts of myself I had abandoned, with curiosity. Not every reconnection was welcomed. Some bridges had burned too long ago. That hurt. But even that pain was honest. And honesty is lighter than regret. One of the strangest discoveries was how little I actually needed to be content. For decades, I believed fulfillment required achievement, bigger goals, bigger milestones, bigger outcomes. But fulfillment, it turns out, comes from alignment, when how you spend your time matches what you claim to value. When those two are out of sync, no amount of success can compensate. I noticed something else as well. Fear didn't disappear when I got older. It just changed costumes. When I was young, I feared failure. When I was older, I feared irrelevance. But fear has one constant trait. It always argues for delay. It always says, not now. And if you listen to it long enough, now eventually runs out. There is a cruel misunderstanding about courage. People think courage appears when fear leaves. In reality, courage is choosing despite fear. I didn't become brave at 70. I simply became unwilling to waste what little time I had left. This is what most people don't realize until it's very late. The cost of change decreases as time decreases. When you believe you have forever, the stakes of change feel high. When you realize you don't, the stakes of staying the same become unbearable. At 85, I don't regret that my life was imperfect. I regret how long I waited to live it on purpose. In the next part, I'll share the single question that reshaped every decision I made afterward and why asking it sooner could save you decades of quiet regret. The question that changed everything for me was painfully simple. That's usually how truth arrives: quiet, obvious, and impossible to argue with once you hear it. I began asking myself, before every meaningful decision, if this were one of my last years, would I still choose this? Not should I choose it, not does it look responsible, but would I choose it knowing what I now know about time? This question stripped away excuses instantly. It exposed how many things I was doing out of habit, fear, or obligation rather than intention. Some answers were uncomfortable, many were disappointing. But clarity, even when it hurts, is a gift. I realized how often I had mistaken endurance for virtue. I stayed in situations long past their usefulness because I was proud of my tolerance. I called it loyalty. I called it discipline. In reality, it was avoidance of change, of uncertainty, of admitting that something once right was no longer right. When you're younger, quitting feels like failure. When you're older, staying too long feels like betrayal to yourself. Another realization followed quickly. Life doesn't become meaningful all at once. It becomes meaningful in fragments. In ordinary days handled with care. In small decisions made honestly. In choosing depth over accumulation, I stopped asking, "What will this get me?" and started asking, "What will this cost me?" Not in money, but in energy, attention, and time with the people I love. That shift changed everything. Some opportunities lost their shine immediately. Promotions, recognition, even praise, all things I once chased, suddenly looked expensive. They demanded too much of the only currency I could never replenish. Time. I also understood why people resist this way of thinking. It forces accountability. You can no longer blame circumstances, age, or timing. If you're honest, you must admit that most of your life is shaped not by dramatic events, but by daily choices, repeated quietly. And that's terrifying because it means you are far more responsible for your life than you want to believe. I watched people around me continue as before, even as their health declined and their world narrowed. They spoke endlessly about the past, or vaguely about the future, but rarely about the present. The present is demanding. It asks something of you now. The past and future ask nothing. I don't say this with judgment. I lived that way myself, for decades. But once you truly understand that time is finite, not intellectually, but emotionally, you stop bargaining with your days. You stop saving your best self for later. You realize that the life you are waiting to live is not somewhere ahead of you. It is hidden inside the ordinary hours you are currently rushing through. There is another uncomfortable truth I must tell you. No one is coming to give you permission. Not your parents, not your boss, not society. If you wait to feel officially allowed to live the way you want, you will wait forever. At 85, I can tell you this clearly. The people who look most at peace near the end are not the most accomplished. They are the most aligned. Their lives may look small from the outside, but they feel complete from the inside. In the next part, I'll explain what alignment really means in practice and how you can begin correcting course without burning your life down or waiting for a crisis to wake you up. Alignment is not a dramatic overhaul. That misconception keeps many people stuck. They imagine that living intentionally requires quitting everything, disappointing everyone, or blowing up the life they've built. It doesn't. In fact, alignment usually begins quietly, almost invisibly, with small corrections made consistently. For me, alignment meant telling the truth about how things actually felt, not how they were supposed to feel. I began noticing the subtle signals I had ignored for most of my life. The heaviness before certain obligations, the relief when plans were cancelled, the quiet joy in moments that had no measurable value. These signals had always been there. I just dismissed them as irrelevant. But they were not random. They were information. Your body often knows the truth long before your mind is willing to accept it. Alignment meant restructuring my days around energy rather than expectations. I stopped asking, "What should I do today?" and started asking, "What deserves my attention today?" The difference is small in language, but enormous in effect. One question obeys obligation. The other honors intention. I also learned that alignment requires subtraction more than addition. Most people try to fix dissatisfaction by adding something new, a new goal, a new project, a new distraction. But the real work is removal. Removing commitments that no longer serve you. Removing relationships built on habit rather than care. removing noise that drowns out your inner voice. This is uncomfortable work. It feels like loss at first. You worry about disappointing others. You worry about being misunderstood. You worry about who you'll be without the roles you've been playing for decades. But slowly, something unexpected happens. Space appears. And in that space, clarity grows. Another truth became impossible to ignore. Your calendar is your real philosophy. Not your words, not your beliefs, your calendar. How you spend your hours reveals what you truly value, not what you claim to value. When I looked honestly at mine, I didn't like what I saw. Too much time spent maintaining appearances, too little time spent deepening relationships, too many hours given to things that drained me, too few given to things that restored me. So I began adjusting, not drastically, but deliberately. One afternoon reclaimed, one conversation prioritized, one unnecessary obligation declined. These choices seemed insignificant individually. Together, they changed the texture of my life. I also stopped waiting to feel ready. Readiness is another illusion. You don't become ready and then act. You act, and readiness follows. If I had waited to feel confident, calm, or certain, I would still be waiting now. Fear did not disappear. Doubt did not vanish. But neither did they deserve control. Perhaps the most important shift was this. I stopped living as if my life were a rehearsal. For most of my years, I behaved as though the real life would begin later, after I had proven myself, earned rest, or reached some invisible threshold. That mindset quietly robs you of urgency and presence. There is no rehearsal. This is it. Once you accept that, priorities rearrange themselves naturally. You don't need motivational speeches. You don't need dramatic awakenings. You need honesty and the courage to let that honesty guide your choices. In the next part, I'll share the final lesson I learned, one that ties everything together and why understanding it sooner could change not just how you live, but how you die. The final lesson came quietly, the way most truths do when there is no longer any need to impress or explain. It arrived not as an insight, but as a feeling, a calm understanding that settled in over time. Life is not meant to be optimized. It is meant to be experienced. For most of my years, I treated life like a problem to solve. I tried to arrange it efficiently, protect it from risk, and extract maximum value from every decision. I believed control was wisdom, but control narrows your world. Experience expands it. Near the end, nobody measures life by how well it was managed. They measure it by how deeply it was lived. I have sat beside people in their final days. Not once did they speak about status, productivity, or being impressive. They spoke about moments, a laugh they remembered, a hand they held, a place they visited, a risk they were glad they took. And yes, they also spoke about regrets, but those regrets were always about waiting to say what mattered, waiting to forgive, waiting to choose themselves. The great misunderstanding is thinking you have to earn the right to live fully. You don't. You already have it. And every day you delay using it, the cost compounds quietly. At 85, I don't fear death the way I once did. What I fear, what I wish I had feared earlier, is living unconsciously, letting years pass without noticing them, repeating days until life feels small, not because it is, but because I made it that way. Here is what I want to leave you with, as plainly as possible. You will never feel completely ready. You will never have perfect conditions. You will never reach a moment where life stops being complicated. So if you are waiting for those things, you are waiting for something that does not exist. Call the people you love while you can still hear their voices. Do the things that quietly pull at you, even if they don't make sense to others. Protect your health, because everything else depends on it. Stop living for approval, it has an expiration date. And above all, stop postponing your life. One day, sooner than you expect, you will look back and realize that the days you are living right now were once the days you hope to reach. I am 85. I have fewer days ahead than behind. And yet, these final years have been the most honest, present, and meaningful of my life. Because I finally stopped waiting. Don't spend 65 years learning what I learned the hard way. Someday is not coming. Someday is today.